And it is told of Maglor that he could not endure the pain with which the Silmaril tormented him, and he cast it at last into the sea, and thereafter he wandered ever upon the shores, singing in pain and regret beside the waves. For Maglor was mighty among the singers of old, named only after Daeron of Doriath, but he came never back among the people of the Elves. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we're going to be discussing unfinished plotlines that might have resulted in some great sequels to the Silmarillion, Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, some more stories for Tolkien to have written. Now, this isn't to say that the endings we have of these plotlines are bad or anything like that, but perhaps more could have been added for a whole new story. Now, as for how creative Tolkien was, I don't even think it would have taken a giant plotline to result in another book, as he took something as intriguing and minuscule as the Riddle in the Dark chapter, Gollum and the Ring, to build a whole trilogy afterwards. He was amazingly creative, so I don't necessarily know how much of a seed we would need to plant for him to be able to build a full-fledged story out of it. So, my friends, let's look at these potential threads and what could have been. As a quick note here, I have no idea how good or bad these actually would have turned out. They are just ideas that, if Tolkien had had the time and the will to write them well, I think he could have made some absolutely great stories out of them, especially because these are ideas that come from him and his lore. They are the beginnings of ideas that we're just seeing what would happen if we took them a little bit further in this video. But again, if that passion's just not there, like we see with Tolkien and The New Shadow, it just doesn't happen. So, speaking of The New Shadow, let's start there. This was going to actually be Tolkien's original idea for a sequel. I've made a video on this years ago, so check that out. I'll have that in the cards for this video. But ultimately, this is the subsequent World of Men, Fourth Age, a cult of darkness and a cult of the Dark Tree, conspiracies spread through Gondor, all this kind of stuff. It probably would have been the most politically thriller mystery story, perhaps, that Tolkien would have put in Middle-earth. But to Tolkien, it would not have lived up to the original. And to be honest, even in my own small way, I understand this feeling through writing D&D campaigns, when you've had just a great, wonderful story that leaves a few loose ends that you do want to write about. You go to write about some of them sometimes, and it's not as good of a story that follows up on answering those loose ends as the story that originally made them in the first place. So you get kind of left in this tough area of, is it worth it? Is it not? And Tolkien ultimately said it wasn't worth it, so totally agree with that if he felt it wasn't going to be as good as the other stories. Next up, we have one of my favorite ideas for the best potential sequels, storylines, and characters to focus all of it around, and that is the story of Maglor, the last son of Feanor. As the quote said at the beginning of this video, Maglor was the only son of Feanor left that remained after many other elves had perished in the First Age, but honestly, it could be that he even remained in Middle-earth well into the Fourth Age and beyond, after other elves had left. So the idea here is that he would come back into play into the main stories and tales of Middle-earth, with memory of the Elder Days, as well as an oath that still makes him kind of need to reclaim all the Silmarils. He rues the moment that he threw a Silmaril into the ocean out of grief, out of sorrow, and so forth, but now that the world's changed, now that the elves are gone, and now that men are perhaps weaker, perhaps it is time finally to fulfill the Oath of Feanor at last, and perhaps he's a bit of a character who's gone mad because ages and ages of living with grief and sorrow, regret, all of that have kind of maybe twisted his mind. And this could be a world where we almost finally get an evil elf, right? Feanor definitely towed that line for sure, as well as some of the other elves, perhaps during the First Age. But this could be an elf who straight up turned to evil from grief, opposing the West, opposing men, in days where only men really could stand against him, as the dwarves and the hobbits began to fade from the world. Now, a good amount of this story could also happen in lands to the east and to the south, in Rhûn, Harad, Umbar, etc., as well as some mentions of Gondor and Rohan and all of that. And also, what would be cool is the fact that he is such an old character, Again, he would be one of the only remaining elves. Perhaps he even is beginning to fade from the world, which is driving him to act quickly to try to get the Silmarils back from the earth, the sky, and the sea. And perhaps stopping Maglor from, with those Silmarils, bringing about Mandos's first curse, the prophecy, the doom of the Noldor, upon the whole world at large. It'd be a very interesting story, I think. Let me know your thoughts on this one in particular. The Servants of Atumno. Why do we think Sauron and the Balrogs were the only great Maiar that served Morgoth? So this would be an idea that there were other evils. There are other things that served Morgoth, and they did not like or did not agree with Sauron. And so they were in a different part of the world, perhaps they were hidden, and so forth. LOTR's new expansion actually plays with this idea of there being other evils that made Gandalf scared and nervous from the Elder Days that were dormant during Sauron's time, and they only came back after his fall. We'll see what becomes of how the Lord of the Rings Online does this, but I do like the idea that, we don't know everything there is to know about Morgoth, so perhaps he had secrets that were revealed to the world in later ages. These ancient evils of Morgoth that came back into the world during the time of men. Now, this is one of those stories that I do think would be hard to make it as compelling as The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion, to be sure, but it would be interesting nonetheless. Adding on to that idea of ancient evils, we could have had a story, maybe a smaller one, about the Black Númenóreans. And again, perhaps this is where Tolkien would have gone with the new Shadow, something around the Black Númenóreans or their descendants, but the fact that there might still have been lingering Black Númenóreans of old, sacrificing people to Morgoth, using the power of Harad and Rune against the West, could have been a really good setup for another story. The Other Rings of Power, the Lesser Essays of Craft. Now, this is another idea inspired by The Lord of the Rings Online, because this is what they deal with in their first main quest with the Lesser Ring Narquil. So this fact that there were actually more Rings of Power, not counted amongst the 20. They were lesser essays and lesser crafts, but still powerful. And they might have lingered in Middle-earth after The Lord of the Rings. Now, would their power have faded with the end of the one? Probably, but there is still potential there. How would the world of men react to the return of some Rings of Power to them and their knowledge, and so forth? Speaking of the world of men, simply a story about them and their kingdoms and their politics and what really became of Aragorn's lineage and Éomer's lineage and all of that. We know Arnor and Gondor reunited, but would it always stay that way? This is one of those stories where I'm kind of glad that we didn't actually get it, and if we did, it would be definitely more of a shorter story for sure, because it might be too realistic and get away from that idea of fantasy and escapism that we love with Middle-earth. One of my more realistic but absolutely cynical takes on what would eventually happen in Middle-earth is that this idea of Arnor and Gondor being so far away from each other, it's very likely they would have split again as they did in the history of Middle-earth. And perhaps this storyline, even with conjunction of another one from this video, might have found its way into a sequel. Just what would have happened to the world of men. In a story like this, we might see the relationship between Arnor, Gondor, and Rohan change and grow as they made peace in the world of men too. We have some blurbs in the appendices about how Éomer and Aragorn made peace with the enemies of men, and we could see that more fully explored. Reclamation. There are plenty of places left in Middle-earth that still needed to be reclaimed and settled by the Free Peoples after the fall of Sauron. We've got Moria, Mordor, Gundabad, Mirkwood, the Glittering Caves, Ithilien, the West March of the Shire, to name a few. Again, these might be originally newly settled, or they might be reclaimed entirely, but perhaps an anthology of what happened in these lands, what villains appeared, and so forth as the world was reclaimed from Shadow, would have been pretty interesting. We also might have learned more about the nameless things from Moria. The Last Adventures of the Eldar. We do know that some of the elves remained behind for some years yet in Middle-earth, such as Elrond's twin sons, Elladan and Elrohir, as well as Celeborn, and we might have learned more about them hunting the remaining orcs, uncovering the final secrets of Middle-earth, or needing to help pass the world on to men before they too sailed west. A small narrative, a small adventure about them would have been pretty cool. An Adventure East and the Blue Wizards. An Odyssey type of epic where perhaps a man of Gondor sails east to discover lands that only people from the Elder Days and ancient Numenor had seen, other than those men that still lived there perhaps. This character would encounter things like werewolves, the Blue Wizards, and others, potentially preventing a new Dark Lord from rising, before returning home and facing many dangers in doing so. And perhaps because if we're comparing this to the Odyssey, as well as maybe hinting at some of those old Silmarillion tales of adventure, he might even be a tour-like kind of character, perhaps having a moment with a Vala like Olmo, who was forced to reveal themselves in later days. I think this would be a kind of cool adventure into the unknown lands of Tolkien and unknown cultures, peoples, and so forth. This could have been really cool. The Dark Elves and Other Dwarves. As protagonists in another part of the world or antagonists from another side of the world, I think we could have seen a storyline coming from these people. The Dark Elves, the Dwarves, again, maybe this would have to do with the last idea about the Adventure East, but I would have loved to see more stories involving them and involving their cultures. Again, who knows how much of a seed Tolkien would need to spin such a wonderful tale, but perhaps these cultures by themselves could have been really something cool in their own story. What were they doing during The Lord of the Rings? What were they up to? All of that kind of stuff. How are they working with or against the men of the East and the South? Very cool. Finally, we have a rather big one, the Dagor Daggerath, in narrative telling. So this is, again, a crazy big one that we'll end on. This is more of a narrative for what could have been the second prophecy of Mandos. This could have followed Eärendil, Turin, and a few others, mirroring the writings of Ragnarok in the ancient Norse tales, seeing the reclamation and breaking of the three Silmarils, the end of the sun and moon, the resurrection of some amazing heroes and villains, and the final showdown between good versus evil. That would have been awesome, even as just like a short story. But again, I know Tolkien was also playing around with getting rid of the idea of Dagor Daggerath altogether, but some sort of full narrativized version of this would have been sweet. These are the plot lines and sequel ideas that I at least can think of now. Again, I'm not saying they're all, or in fact most of them would have worked or even have been good, and potentially Tolkien would not have liked any of these ideas, but they're interesting to think about nonetheless. What would these stories have looked like? What would the sequels to the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit have actually been if some of these ideas were included? Let me know what you all think in the comments below. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our tale. But even as we come to the end, we must remember that, from these ideas, the tale is never truly over. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Tolkien's unfinished plotlines and potential sequels in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, we have a partnership with Mythologie Candles through the link below. Use the code Men of the West for 10% off of that first order, or check out CastleCon's Lord of the Rings replicas and use the code WEST at checkout. And please take a look at our merch. Join our memberships and Patreon for access to our Discord server and our monthly podcast, an episode of which is coming soon with my good friend Royan. Take a look at Masters of Mythology, our second channel on myths and legends, and thank you so much to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Joby Weasel, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Zoomi, and Peter Sheppard. My friends, thanks for keeping the channel going, and thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to join the Men of the West, and my friends, thank you all for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.